Really pleased that Nancy's here today. I'm sure many of you enjoyed her excellent lecture last night. I think we should get kicked off. So it's my pleasure to introduce Elena Popa, who's going to talk about causality, evidence, and mental psychiatric knowledge, a case for pluralism. Thank you, Elena.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the interest in the talk. So yeah, basically, I'll just go into the topic. Yesterday, we heard several talks in causality, evidence, pluralism, with regard to public health and other health areas. What I'm going to focus on here will be mental health, and particularly looking at it from a global perspective and trying to address issues that arise when trying to approach mental health on a global scale, particularly issues related to all kinds of injustices that arise in such kinds of initiatives. Then I'm going to look at how local approaches can address these kinds of ethical problems and how to integrate them with other approaches from mainstream psychiatry. And I'll then analyze this through look at interventionism and mechanisms, but yeah, I think the project is kind of open for other concepts of causality to come in. So this is an example just to illustrate what the problem is. Following his book on depression, Andrew Solomon has a chapter where he undergoes a ritual treatment. I think it was in West Africa initially, and then this is an article from later on when he visits Rwanda and talks to some mental health workers there. And on this quotation here, you can see a story about basically international mental health workers trying to address post-traumatic stress disorder after the Rwandan genocide, and essentially explaining why these kinds of approaches did not work and might have actually caused more harm than good. I'll just read selectively part of this. So the international mental health workers came here and their practice didn't have any of the strengths of the ritual we just described. They did not identify illness as an invasive external thing. They did not get the entire village to come together and acknowledge it together and participate in trying to support the person who was getting treated. Treatment was not out in the bright sunshine where you feel happy. There was no music or drumming to get the heart running as it should run. Instead, they took people one at a time into sort of dingy little rooms for an hour at a time and asked them to talk about the bad things that had happened to them, which of course made them feel much worse, almost suicidal. We had to put a stop to it. So just to summarize this, so the problem would be addressing post-traumatic stress disorder. The intervention that was available locally was this kind of ritual healing, which involved a group, which took place outside, also involved music and other relevant practices. The approach used by an international team was cognitive behavioral therapy. Of course, there are several differences between these two approaches. One of them is how they understand mental disorder. So for the ritual healing, one, mental disorder is understood as an external thing, and then this kind of ritual is meant to address, so to make this external issue go away. On the other hand, cognitive behavioral therapy identifies the problem inside the person, as it were, and this is often stigmatized, which was the case here, possibly in other situations as well. So choosing which approach to use in a particular context and which implication it has, for instance, on the understandings of mental disorders and consequences for the people that need help raises questions about justice. So is it fair, to have an approach that perhaps does more harm than good or doesn't help, and then to minimize or exclude approaches that are used locally for similar problems. And now to broaden this up from this example to broader mental health policy issues, we could subsum this under epistemology and ethics. There are policies that ignore the local context, and then, yeah, maybe sometimes they just don't work, sometimes they could cause more harm. And discussions over the mental health movement basically drew attention to these problems. Interestingly, yes, so there are sociologists, anthropologists, cultural psychiatrists that have been critical of the global mental health movement. There's not so much philosophical work done on this, which is surprising because, yes, we have this epistemological questions, ethical questions, political questions about justice. So I think it's philosophically, it's an interesting issue to explore. Now, one of the themes that comes up in these kinds of critiques is the support of particularly biomedical approaches to psychiatry, and then overlooking local understandings and approaches. Here, I'm not only going to look at biomedical psychiatry, I'm just noting that this is one of the lines of criticism, but as the example before showed, this could also hold for psychotherapy or other approaches. I'll just mention this briefly because my focus here basically is on causality rather than on the ethical and political issues. But there are several types of injustice that you can identify in cases like this. And this is important, again, to emphasize why we need to look at causality and that the efficiency of various interventions. One of them could be a type of epistemic injustice. So broadly speaking, the notion of epistemic injustice has been introduced for cases when the credibility of a speaker is tied to their social standing. And in global context, and when you have this global north, global south dynamics, the kind of subtype of epistemic injustice here would be participatory one. So when the kind of knowledge that is available locally is not taken seriously because it's seen as being lower in this hierarchy of social power. But there are also concerns about justice outside of the epistemic realm, for instance, procedural justice. So whether those that are affected by a policy are involved in the decision-making process. Distributive one, if we talk about equal access to mental health care, and we can connect these to broader work on health justice. And then we can also think of relational notions of justice. So as freedom from domination. So if you have a certain intervention that doesn't make sense for people in a certain culture and maybe doesn't help, it does feel like an imposition to make people comply with this kind of intervention. So now I'm going to look a little bit at evidence-based medicine and policy and basically why we end up with cases like this. So in the 2008 WHO Action Plan for Global Mental Health, there is a statement saying that interventions should be culturally appropriate, but also evidence-based. And here we see a kind of tension, because if by evidence-based we mean evidence-based medicine, evidence-based medicine is actually poorly equipped to look into interventions that are culturally appropriate. So again, I think this was talked about yesterday, so I'm not going to go into details, but you have the hierarchy of evidence, and then systematic reviews are at the top, which are reviews of randomized controlled trials. And then let's say case studies are quite low in the hierarchy. So if you have evidence of a certain intervention working on the basis of a case study, let's say in a village, in Rwanda as in the example there, this is not going to score very high on the evidence hierarchy. And most of this evidence is quantitative, whereas when you look at culturally appropriate interventions, then qualitative evidence also comes in. And this is something I'll be talking about in a moment. And yeah, so we can connect this particular issue with broader critiques of evidence-based medicine and policy. One big issue here is the external validity problem. So even if you show, let's say, psychotherapy to work somewhere, it doesn't mean that it works in this particular context that you're interested in. as Nancy Cartwright's work showed. And when we talk about interventions that were designed for a global north kind of setting and are exported in the global south, this is exacerbated because there's a history of such interventions, often with very bad consequences. So there's this additional layer of distrust that's justified in the context of these previous relations. Then there are all sorts of biases too that are relevant for the case here. The financial bias. So since RCTs are expensive, and it's mostly private companies that fund them, treatments that can be monetized are researched. It's easier to monetize things that maybe affect, so treatments for illnesses that affect more well-off people. It's more difficult. So you get, for instance, neglected diseases, but also kinds of interventions that maybe you cannot monetize, you cannot market like you would, let's say, a biomedical intervention. And then what's been called the pill bias. You can run an RCT with a drug and with placebo, and this can be blind. You cannot really run blind trials on, let's say, psychotherapy. You can compare two types of psychotherapy. Same for religious healing. Yeah, maybe you can give them some ritual or some other ritual, send them to different institutions, but this is not going to be blind. So whatever evidence you get for this other interventions is not going to score as high as the evidence for some of the biomedical interventions. And again, in this context, this is a problem. So now I'm going to look at some ways of moving beyond these issues. So one of them would be just to not go with evidence-based medicine at all, and look at medical cosmopolitanism as it has been introduced by Alex Broadbent. Medical cosmopolitanism is broadly introduced as a stance towards medicine, and then it constitutes of 4 main stances. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'll just briefly explain them here. The metaphysical one consists of commitment to realism, and the idea is that there are disagreements in medical contexts, and then when there is a disagreement, there is a right answer to be found. So it's not the case that, let's say, contradicting views are both true. It's a matter of trying to find out which one is true. So there is like a right and a wrong kind of position in disagreements. The epistemic one consists of readiness to change one's views in light of new evidence, and this is also called epistemic humility. An ethical one, giving equal worth to all human beings, and the practical one, also known as the primacy of practice, holding that agreement on courses of actions should take precedence over disagreement about principles or overarching views. So if something is shown to work, even if it doesn't work within a particular theoretical setup that someone prefers, we should still go for that course of action if we think it's helpful in medical context. Now, another way to go would be the EBM plus way, which again, we heard about it yesterday. So according to EBM plus, evidence about mechanisms is also included when making causal inferences in medical contexts. And this is in addition to difference-making information. So difference-making information is singled out through randomized control trials. For mechanisms, you would need different methods. And now, so these are 2 different ways of addressing the issues of evidence-based medicine. What's the difference? So for EBM plus, the focus is on mechanisms. For medical cosmopolitanism, the range of evidence is wider, and this has also been subject to critique. I will review some of these differences in a moment, but I'm not really willing to take a stance on this right now. So I'll take the kind of bottom line that the evidence base should be broadened. How broad should it be? I'm not taking a stance yet. So what we can agree on so far is that the way forward would be to incorporate local knowledge if it's shown to work in practice. And then this requires moving beyond the quantitative approach that is tied to EBM. And so this can be done under medical cosmopolitanism, for instance, so by taking a piecemeal approach, You can look at cases, for instance, from medical anthropology, or through the use of ethnographic methods or ethnosciences. So you have case studies, you have smaller samples, and then you can draw qualitative information from them. This is also compatible with EDM Plus insofar as we talk about social mechanisms, and I'll try to say more about this in a couple of slides' time. Before I do that, one challenge here is how to integrate approaches that are highly heterogeneous, maybe incommensurable at some point, because yeah, if let's say mental disorder is understood as something external, as something that's connected to one's religious commitments, versus if mental disorder is understood in this maybe biological way related, let's say, to the chemistry of the brain, a lot of the claims and a lot of the approaches are just not going to work together. So how to bring this together in a kind of coherent approach. And for this, my suggestion is to go for the partially overlapping ontology framework. This was introduced by Ludwig and Weisskopf in the context of local ecological knowledge. It's a value-laden kind of claim. So although, yeah, for time constraints, I'm not going to be talking about this today, but if you're interested, I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. This works for, in the case of mental health, if we take a normative stance towards concepts of mental health and the mental disorder. So here you can see how in the ontology you have material factors that figure in, but also cultural, political, cognitive factors. So that's how, so these are for biological categories. My claim is that we can expand this to categories such as mental disorders. The idea would be that you have partial overlaps. So some categories have convergence points, but they also have diverging elements. And thus we get the distinctly local ontological systems. So the idea would be if we have an understanding of mental disorder that holds, let's say in Western Europe or the United States, that might overlap with some, let's say, understandings of mental disorders according to local knowledge systems in some other part of the world. And insofar as they acknowledge, let's say, some biological aspects of mental disorder, then you have this overlap. But then if they have, let's say, maybe the spiritual aspects of mental disorders, which are not acknowledged in this other concept, then that would be the divergence point. And the idea would be that, yes, you put together all these views and you will get overlaps, but you will also get points of divergence, and we should acknowledge both of them. So now trying to address this, from this perspective of broadening the range of evidence, the hard disagreement here seems to be about what to do about the evidence hierarchy, so to replace it or to reform it so that evidence about mechanisms comes in. The other question is what we mean by mechanism, and again, I will go a little bit into this because again, here medical cosmopolitanism appears to be a bit more encompassing. So for instance, in Ludwig's other work, also on traditional ecological knowledge, the notion of mechanism is used, but is not used in an ontological kind of sense. Rather, it's used in this pragmatic way. So mechanisms are seen as heuristics. So what they do, yes, I think in this particular study that I'm citing, they review fishermen's knowledge about the stream, and you have some explanations that refer to mechanisms about freshwater, killing some fish, and then you essentially get something like a mechanism. Of course, they don't use the term mechanism in the local kind of description of this, but when we analyze it philosophically, we can use mechanisms, but again, not necessarily connecting that to the ontology. So that's one potential thing to look at, so how we use these terms. But again, what we can agree on is that the notion of mechanism and mechanistic explanation with regard to these causal processes featuring local knowledge can be done. So I think that's the upshot here. So now I'm going to look at the case study, which I've looked at in previous work, but again, in relation to normativity and concepts of mental health and disorder. So before I go into the example and the studies, a little bit of background of local psychiatric approaches that are used in India. There are three main things to highlight here. namely that there is this conceptualization of mental illness in connection to biomedical psychiatry. On the other hand, there are not enough resources being allocated to psychiatric hospitals and training psychiatrists and so on, which means that a very large chunk of the population, actually you could even say the majority of people who need help with mental health problems, have to resort to other kinds of approaches because the biomedical ones are not accessible. And then when we talk about local approaches, there is the traditional Ayurvedic approach to psychiatry, which is deemed legitimate. Then there are rules of who gets to practice what under this view, and then other practices that are used informally. And again, these other practices are very popular because also many people don't have access, like even to this institutional Ayurvedic practices. And then the third thing to highlight is that although there is this power and prestige that's associated with the biomedical approach, that's also associated with stigma. And then medical anthropologists, for instance, have pointed out this social integration problem. So maybe in a context where a medical understanding of mental disorder is highly stigmatized, it's possible to look for other kinds of approaches and get other understandings of mental illness that might make it easier to tackle in this context. So now, yes, this is a case that I've looked at previously in the paper. I'll just look at two studies here on two states in southern India. One of them by Halliburton was in Kerala, actually several, so he has also a book, a couple of articles, also a more recent one, which I didn't mention here. So this is a broader kind of scope. He looks at people who seek mental health assistance at religious institutions, at Ayurvedic practices, and at psychiatric hospitals. And also, for religious institutions, this includes churches, mosques, and Hindu temples. So it's quite a broad kind of range, culturally speaking, and in terms of the approaches used. And the thing that Halliburton stresses from the findings here is that most people say they felt better after they sought help with one of these institutions. And one pattern that he noticed is that many people actually switched. So let's say they went to the psychiatric hospital, they were not really happy with the results, and then they went to maybe Ayurvedic practice or religious healing. And essentially all of the patients that did that reported feeling better. What's the explanation for that? I'll go to that in the next slide. The other study, which was, took place earlier and in a way inspired some of this subsequent research, but this is only at one institution, so it's a Hindu temple, so by Raghuram and collaborators. Here, basically, the intervention consisted in allowing the patients to spend several weeks or months at the temple, and these were patients with very severe mental health symptoms. They didn't participate into any particular rituals other than taking part in some daily chores and prayers. And after following up, so this was in let's say a couple of weeks or months time, the improvement rates that they reported under the brief psychiatric rating scale were comparable to those under medication for people with their symptoms. So what are the explanations? So for this last one with the temple, so Raghuram suggests that the temple works as a place of respite, and then insofar as places where psychiatric patients can spend a longer time are less and less available, it becomes also more difficult to treat these kinds of symptoms. So for Raghuram, it's not so much the religious aspect that's important, but rather the possibility of spending a longer period of time away from circumstances that maybe are linked to experiencing mental health problems. For the Halliburton studies, the explanation is in terms of agency. So first of all, if patients get to choose what treatment they want, and secondly, if there are enough options available, then that might also fit with their personal preferences and values. So if you have maybe only two choices and you don't really like either, maybe agency doesn't help that much. But if you have a broader range of choices and you have agency, then you're more likely to feel better. And Halliburton, defends pluralism in a recent article on this. Of course, these have also been challenged. For instance, for the agency explanation, whether patients wouldn't be confused. So if you have a mental health problem and then you think, what do I do about it? And I have all these options. Does it help to have this broader range? I don't really have an answer to this. From the back of my head, I would say that this does seem to be raised also against cosmopolitanism. So maybe in places where there are people who speak different languages, have different religions and so on, and this is part of the everyday, maybe it's not so difficult to think that also multiple approaches could work at the same time without people necessarily being confused. So now, yes, I'm going to move to the causal analysis part. So can we make sense of findings like this and explanations of why these interventions work through some of the currently available philosophical approaches to causation? So the first one is the interventionist one, which has been also discussed in the context of psychiatry. The idea would be that a variable is the cause of another variable if the effect variable is invariant under interventions from the cause. Interventions should meet this arrow breaking feature, which is depicted there. So it should be disconnected from any of its potential causes to rule out confounding. Now, the benefit of this in this particular context, but in psychiatry more broadly, is that insofar as you can trace this invariance pattern, you don't need to solve these theoretical clashes. So let's say, between how religious healing is supposed to work and how pharmaceutical approaches are supposed to work, insofar as you see improvement in mental health as a result of basically providing more or less medication, providing exposure to these kinds of rituals or approaches, then you can say you have a causal connection without trying to solve this clash. So could we actually formulate this as hypothesis under interventionism? Maybe we could have something like a control group, so people that have similar symptoms, and maybe opt for other religious healing options that do not involve this longer term stay at a temple, and maybe they'll take medication and so on. And the other hypothesis, so compatibilities with the values of the patient and exercising agency, maybe control groups should be people that are unable to change treatments. However, the issue here is that most of this evidence, as we spoke, has been collected through ethnographic methods, which do not go well with interventionism. So you cannot really surgically intervene on one particular aspect of this cultural background. And also, yes, so if you are looking at contexts where you don't have a plurality of approaches available, this might be another country, another part of the world, so you might have all sorts of other factors involved. Again, you cannot really surgically intervene on that. So the answer here would be basically to look at how to incorporate qualitative methods and to mix them with evidence that you get from quantitative ones. And I think, so here we can look at the mechanistic concept of causation to see how it would help. So again, mechanisms have also been connected to causality and psychiatry. And one, I think, relevant model is connecting to defining mental disorders as mechanistic property clusters. You have the illustration there. So that includes causes, and you see for some of the causes you have this looping kind of effect, which often happens. Let's say, yes, in depression, you have rumination, but you also have negative self-image. So you have rumination about negative thoughts, they reinforce one another and lead to the person feeling depressed. So the question here is how to define mechanisms. Here I'm going to go with the entities and activities account. And so, yeah, the benefit here is that mechanisms could also explain how and why certain factors cause mental illness or recovery, and it captures the complexity of mental disorders. And here we could try to identify relevant mechanisms. So social mechanisms, so how taking distance from stressful circumstances can help someone, how exercising one's choice and following their own values and preferences can also contribute to better mental health. So that would be a psychological mechanism. And there is a pattern that has been noted, the so-called Gulf syndrome, where workers, again, from southern India, returning from the Middle East, where they were working, would seek admission for medical tests for, again, a longer period of time. And these are medical tests that they don't need. So the explanation here, again, is that these tests actually work as giving them an excuse to spend some time away from stressful circumstances. And here the stress would be on basically what to do with the money that they made in the Middle East, how to handle demands from various parts of their families and social circles. So this could be put together as a kind of social mechanism that involves resources, demands, and so on. Just a short note that this could also be biological, but due to time constraints, I'm not going to go into it, because my overall suggestion here will be that we can put this together under social determinants of health kind of perspective. One issue here is how to think about mechanisms. And we can think about, as I mentioned before, in terms of activities. There have been critiques against this. I think I'll go quickly through this. There are ways of approaching. So Glennon, for instance, says if we have lower level mechanisms, then we can explain further what goes on in an activity. But there is a problem here, and this is where more basically metaphysical work needs to be done. If we look at how mechanisms are discussed in the social determinants of health literature, mostly it comes down to neural activities. For instance, health effects of stress have been documented, so top-down dysregulation. But again, it just comes out to connections, and of course top-down. So stress involved in some physiological processes, but also physiological processes manifesting themselves in let's say, mental states. So the need here is to specify social structures and mechanisms that affect health. And just to use this example before, so entities in a mechanism involving the stressful circumstances kind of hypothesis would be family members, workplace colleagues, other groups that the person is part of, resources that they have, and then activities would be things like social pressure, so demands, exercising one's agency, so answering these demands, taking distance if this is too stressful, moving away from them. So we could put this together in a mechanism. So now, finally, yes, I would like to bring this together with mixed methods. So mechanisms have been linked to mixed methods, particularly singling out local causation in qualitative interviews, for instance, or ethnographic work. And then this can be brought together with work on quantitative methods. And yes, in this Johnson et al. Article, there's talk about combining evidence of local causation with evidence of general causation, so the qualitative and quantitative together, and mechanisms could be part of the local causation bit. And then, I mentioned this already. So surgical interventions are difficult to use when looking at things that are related to social structure and the social fabric. You cannot really surgically intervene. And this has been pointed out, in population health concerns, for instance. And maybe mechanisms would be a better choice here, but we need to think about them at least metaphysically beyond neural processes, so to try to see how social processes come in. And maybe another route to this is through connecting mechanisms with mixed methods and approaches in sociology, like the life world approach by Russo and Kelly. So there, one of the things that Russo and Kelly mentioned in this recent article is that there are explanations of health effects of social structure. In theory, they talk about public health, but I think for mental health, this also holds here. So how particular structures affect health outcomes, so mechanisms could be spelled out here. But, and this is the point that I want to end with, we do have a problem that once we have these methods, whether they work well together or whether they are incommensurable. And again, there is work on other social aspects that affect health. For instance, Monk's work on causes of suicide, my recent work on health effects on loneliness. The problem is if you operationalize these notions in different ways and you measure them in different ways, maybe sometimes quantitatively, sometimes qualitatively, according to different models, again, you don't really necessarily have a picture that fits well together. So the answer to this, I think, would be radical pluralism along the lines of Helen Longino's work. And I think in global context, this is particularly important, given that we have to also acknowledge the differences rather than only focus on the things that are common with the mainstream psychiatric approaches. So insofar as these concepts can be fundamentally different, we should acknowledge that, and a radical pluralist kind of take can help that. And of course, there is this need of further specifying the context. Maybe this incommensurability problem is not as big as we think, but again, more research should be done there for this. These are the conclusions. I think I can just leave them here. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Elena. So I'm just moving here because the microphone, is the microphone working? Sorry? Okay, so the microphone doesn't work today. Thank you very much. So people can either ask a question and I'll repeat it, or they can run up just for people online and make sure that they do within the vicinity of a microphone. And let's.
Thanks very much. Really sympathetic to the idea that with regards to mental health, we should kind of be more pluralist and allow them to kind of invent and try and think about moving away from very, very strict EGM hierarchy and allow that. So one thing I have some thoughts about whether or not this is kind of letting say healing or other kind or homeopathy or other kind of especially with regard to saying more physical ailments, whether or not that's an issue to you when you think that's a good outcome or something that we can kind of work to make kind of distinction between, say, these kind of community-based mental health that seem, intuitively as imagining just as successfully certain kinds of therapies that are administered in Western medicine, and other countries.
Yes, thank you. I think yes.
Sorry, just for the
sorry.
No, it's okay. So just to summarize the question, Alexander Franklin says he's very sympathetic to the idea that we should have more mixed methods in psychiatry and to these kind of community practices, but he's wondering whether allowing that would also open a door for example, faith healing or homeopathy in relation to physical illnesses, and whether Elena thinks that is welcome or that might be a problem.
I think to some extent we have to distinguish the context, right? So are they used also in places where people don't have access to, let's say, mainstream medicine? Because if they don't, that's one argument to say, like, if there's no other option, it's probably better that they have, even if it's homeopathy, they have faith healing and so on, rather than nothing. So I would say in that context, they should be there. So of course, you have this other context where they are available alongside other practices, right? And in that case, I think, yes, you do need some sort of evidence of how they work. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be evidence, it's just evidence shouldn't be thought of in this very strict way in which you need an RCP for these. So we should have looser evidence standards but that doesn't mean that anything goes. And of course, some of these could be harmful. So I'm not saying that methods that are harmful to the patient, even if they're traditional, because yeah, just because they're traditional doesn't necessarily mean that they are helpful. So that's another potential problem. What I'm saying is to focus on interventions that have been shown to work. So if they have been shown to work also for physical ailments, I would probably say that that's fine. Maybe, yeah, my prediction would be that there will be fewer cases like this than in the case of mental health, but I would go this way. So say if they are shown to work according to evidence standards that are moving beyond the problems of evidence-based medicine, I think that's okay, but we need more work also to specify the context.
Do you want to
So my question is just about the way that you understand mechanism. So if it's just about, did this work here? And if we show that something is working, then we shouldn't be too worried about whether or not it's a local or a Western medical practice. But really the whole point is, how do we know that it worked? Right? What are the evidence standards for deciding whether it worked? That is the issue in the first place. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I mean, as some of these were surveys, so actually some evidence was quantitative, and you have the brief psychiatric rating scale. Maybe people who are not happy with that, and there are people saying you cannot really, and this is even outside of the local interventions. So if you have a patient that needs help and so on, can you tell on the basis of this brief scale how they are, or should the psychiatrist actually spend more time with them and so on? But this would be quantitative, but the idea is that we shouldn't stop there. So we can use this initial evidence that we have to formulate it as a hypothesis and then try to test it with different types of evidence. So of course, if you have this kind of survey or self-reports, and again, many people are critical of self-reports, but in mental health, again, they are crucial because ultimately you want to see how the patient is feeling. So you start with having some evidence and then you formulate this as a hypothesis and you test it. But again, so the evidence base should be broader. That's my claim. Does this explain? And mechanisms, because yes, so mechanisms come in when you're trying to see how or why a certain thing works. Because you start from this, they go to the temple, they say they're feeling better. You have the evidence from the surveys that you took or from the interviews that you had with them. Let's try to see further how this works and why are they feeling better. So that requires, further looking into this and gathering more evidence.
Slight reservations about suggesting that it's extrapolating from what we do in the mental health area to medicine and gym. I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to say that whatever the general success of the environment model is not being fantastic, it would be disease burden of mental health. And also you're looking at conditions of this very largely immediate behavioral and social aspects, perhaps more so than more physical conditions. And I suppose it was raising the question of how much we should learn from mental health as far as good practice regarding testing.
Yeah, so just to summarize the question for the people online, a question is, should we be wary about extrapolating for the mental health context to the physical health context? And does it matter that these are mental conditions on which kind of Western medicine doesn't have a great track record at all, and also are substantially mediated by kind of social behavioral aspects of this, meaning given?
Thank you. I agree that I don't think we can extrapolate it to the same degree, but I would still say that there are some relevant things for physical health conditions, particularly the social determinants. And again, maybe this is not so much for treatment, but for prevention and public health, it is relevant to see if people live in a certain kind of environment, which is the case in some part of the world, but not in another part of the world, and that affects people, let's say diet, whatever's available as a diet, right? Or again, kinds of social relations that they are in, and maybe changes that happen. Yeah, that is the case for mental health in the Kerala studies, for instance. So connection with migration, industrialization, and so on. So these have health effects. I would say they are not only mental health effects, they're also physical health effects related to this. So I would say in that respect, I think some of these points transfer. Maybe not so much, in treating, let's say, you have a certain surgery that's very efficient in treating a particular illness, then the intervention would be to make the surgery available in this, let's say, lower resource context. So I agree with you on that side. In the social causes of illness, I think there are common things with mental health as well.
So incorporating local knowledge is a welcome suggestion. I think basically, in my opinion, everywhere in Cleveland and in Mumbai. But I wonder why you think it has any particular methodological or epistemic bearing on how we should think about evidence. I mean, all the kinds of problems that you describe about understanding how interventions work in India are true in Cleveland too. And it seems to me like I would want to, raid the entire methodological armory of social, medical, epidemiological, anthropological science to address both in the same way. And the only reason that there's some kind of asymmetry, maybe if at all, is that like maybe certain kinds of evidence are more available, or certain kinds of designs are more feasible, but there is no in principle methodological consequence of incorporating local knowledge. Do you agree with that, or is that wrong?
I don't think I disagree. But just to make sure that I understand your point, because my point is, if you have the strict evidence standards, then you end up excluding this kind of knowledge, which is a kind of epistemic injustice with further consequences down the line. And I think it's worse, in global context, the global mental health program has been criticized for exporting psychiatry. So the idea would be that you cannot just export an intervention that works somewhere else without looking at what's available locally. If you want to look at what's available locally, however, evidence-based medicine doesn't help in that sense. So my idea would be to show basically one more argument for moving beyond. You can view it in that way. One more argument for moving beyond evidence-based medicine and for using a broader range of methods and then causal concepts that come with them. So I don't know if
I don't think it's an
understand
essential disagreement.
I also think we agree, but I think I'm going like the opposite route. So saying these are the limitations of this model and they have real world consequences. And if you want to address that, we have to expand on the evidence.
John.
Thank you. I would think that whether it's not very I was looking for because I can see that every part of the president mechanism for contractions and parts. Community studies, interventions with voice therapy, music therapy, therapy, and there's cognitive work on how we respond well to we can find respond well to, and that means can you say something about why we might go beyond that to whether further factors can be.
Yeah, so John Williamson is asking whether it's enough to stop at EBM plus and to look at all sorts of various mechanisms, whether we really have to move further to non-focus functional.
Thank you. Cosmopolitanism. Thank you. Yes, I didn't want to take a stance on this, but partly because I still haven't made up my mind. I would say starting with mechanisms is a promising way to go. So at this stage of the project, yeah, I would be happy with examples. And yeah, thank you for mentioning these studies with music therapy and social kind of interventions. I think for agency also there are studies, and also with physical health. So that's another place to look for mechanisms. I would maybe say again, in the context where we have local approaches that don't always work together with mainstream medicine, you might want to leave the door open for some things which maybe don't fit well with the mechanism framework or any other kind of philosophical framework that we have here. And you might still want to say that there's some evidence of them working, but we cannot spell it out in terms of mechanisms. Maybe there are other concepts or other ways of thinking about it that we could use. One of them could be dispositions. I only listed that in the conclusions again, because of time concerns, but you could maybe say that dispositions are not that different from mechanisms. And that's another debate which I don't want to go into, but maybe dispositions people could say you could have a dispositional notion of causation, and you could agency, for instance. So let's say a relational notion of agency. So how much can you do given your social environment and constraints that are imposed on it? Does it make you more likely to do this or that? And that has consequences on health. Could you spell this out of as a mechanism? Probably. Again, I think I would like to keep the door open to many possibilities rather than taking a stance. I hope that's satisfying the answer.
Okay, the last question, please, Owen.
Hi, thanks very much. What you were describing as mixed methods, I would say is really in relation to health services, so it's quite standard. So I think we recommend that some of that when you explain EBM with class, the mixed methods is and then the other comment is about stigma and the biomedical model of mental disorder as stigmatizing. Of course, this with it, there was a lot of hope that we reduce stigma through having biomedical that but we know has become more complicated through that. But the reason I use stigma is that's why I had having stigmatized. So that's just, we want to say, so the question is really about this, this temporary time. So you don't have to go to India to find this. I live in London. So in Salem, where I work in London, each caseload people with mental disorder are not held really by entities, people like psychiatric services. They're held by religious caseloads. For example, Pentecostal. So what you're suggesting is that it's entirely intensive therapy development. And then you're translating that into effectively stress prevention. So you're already translating it out to give you something that is essentially set up with any kind of savings account. But that's not what the church, that's not how people within church experience in that meeting. It's not about stress reduction. It's about something that happens supernaturally within the spaces. But that's where you get into the kind of implementation problem. And I wonder whether, is that part of your idea of cosmopolitanism? Well, I really need to translate.
Yes, so just to summarize, question from Gareth Owen, who brings a perspective as a psychiatrist and many other things. So the first thing was a comment that in health services said mixed methods is the standard. So it didn't quite recognize using EBM or the EBM plus as a foil. The second issue was that it was a note that it was interesting that the biomedical model was characterized as stigmatizing when the history of the model was that it was intended to reduce stigma. And then the third question was about the temporal healing, which Gareth said that examples of that in London, where faith groups have large amounts of psychiatric caseloads. And he was pointing out that Dr. Pope characterized this immediately in a kind of a secular way as stress reduction, whereas people who are in these faith communities experience them very differently, namely as some supernatural phenomena being the essential part of the mechanism. And that raises a problem with interventionality. Did I get that right, Gareth?
Thank you. So I'll start with the comment. The first part was about EBM plus and practice. I agree with that. It's just, I think the bottom line is that this should translate to research and policy. Because yes, so this is, I think, also not only for psychiatry, for other parts of medicine, where, yeah, the doctor does take the patient's, let's say, social environment into consideration and so on when they're looking at their illness. It's just, yes, for policy level and for research level, the focus does fall, let's say, on the quantitative biomedical aspects. So I think we should bring these two closer together, so the practice with the research and the policy. So yeah, I don't disagree with your comment. With the stigma and biomedical approaches, yes, I agree, it's very complicated. In places where there is a colonial history, there's a good reason why this concept is more stigmatized, because it was brought, as it were, from the outside, and then it was associated with the era of the asylum psychiatry. And yeah, it's difficult to get into it. What I would say is, depending on the kind of case study and context that you're looking at, then you have to explain why, yes, the biomedical understanding maybe is more stigmatized than another. But yes, so in, I think, Western context, many people would say, yeah, this is an illness rather than, let's say, a fault in character. So then the biomedical model would help destigmatize. But when this biomedical model comes from, yes, you have, let's say, spirit possession versus biochemistry in the brain again. So is the illness the problem with the person, or is the problem from outside? That does lead to some stigma. Now the question, I agree. So there are aspects that maybe are not translatable, and that's one big reason for choosing these partial overlapping ontologies. Do we need to translate it? I think as philosophers we do. So I think this is something that philosophers could do, didn't do that much, but you have to acknowledge that the translation is not perfect. So this, actually, it's the anthropologists that explained it in terms of the respite kind of thing. So it's also interesting when you do this kind of anthropological study, and again, medical anthropology. So they focused on the social, because of course there are social aspects in religion. The same you could say for people that go to church. Maybe they go there not because they believe in such and such entity, but because they get the sense of community. But I agree there might be something more than, so maybe I can understand the sense of community. I cannot understand the commitment to the existence of supernatural beings. But if someone takes that seriously, of course you have to factor that in when you think about their situation. But I think through the partial overlapping worldviews and ontologies, yeah, so some of this remains untranslatable. I acknowledge that, but I think it's valuable to translate it, because then we can talk about it across cultures and methods, and maybe we can have a more inclusive framework. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. There are two comments in the chat, but we're very much out of time. So Rivka's going to put them up and people can read them during the break. We are having what we call coffee break. That means you're allowed to stretch your legs, you're allowed to see there's a coffee, you're allowed to move, you start straight back, you're not allowed to hit each other.
Let's start again at 11:30.